Hello, friend. Welcome to the Galactic HFY Story, where stories and science combine to create the magic. With real human voices, no robotic or AI voices here. Only real human voices with real human touch. So please subscribe my channel and press the bell icon for the latest updates and get ready for the real experience of science. Let's start.
They didn't fear our ships. They didn't fear our numbers. They feared the ones we sent when ships weren't enough. The ones who came after everything else had already failed. The ones with no insignia, no rank markers, no record in any database the Galactic Accord could access. The galaxy had a name for them, eventually. It took 3 wars, 2 massacres, and 1 incident on a moon that no cartographer will officially acknowledge to earn it. But they earned it. Every syllable. The Velthari had a word for humans. It translated roughly as the ones who haven't died yet. Not a compliment. More of a bureaucratic annotation. The kind of label a xenobiologist might stamp on a sample jar containing something unremarkable and probably temporary. And the Accord used it in official documentation the way you'd say pending review or status. Inconclusive. Humans had been spacefaring for less than 200 years. The Velthari had been spacefaring for 11,000. The math was self-explanatory as far as they were concerned. Ambassador Seal Varath of the Velthari Conclave arrived at the Accord Assembly with 3 aides, a translation lattice embedded behind his left ocular cluster, and the particular brand of diplomatic patience that comes from dealing with species who think chairs are the height of furniture innovation. He was not unkind. He was simply accurate. When the human delegation requested a seat on the security consortium, Seal Varath had voted pending review without malice and without a second thought. They submitted a 14-page application, his aide Thurin murmured as they walked the corridor after the session. 14. The Dorhai submitted 2. The Dorhai have been members for 300 years, Seal Varath said. Exactly. The human delegation's representative, a woman named Commander Isolt Farron, dark-eyed, compact, wearing a uniform that Seal Varath privately found aggressively utilitarian, had not protested the vote. She had simply looked at him across the chamber floor with an expression he couldn't pass. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something that read, through the translation lattice, as noted. He didn't think about her again for 6 months. The Keth Expanse was not technically anyone's territory. That was the problem. A corridor of 17 star systems running along the spinward edge of mapped space. The expanse had been contested for the better part of 4 centuries by 3 species who each had overlapping claims going back to surveys that predated accurate record-keeping. The Velthari had a claim. The Dorhai had a claim. A 3rd species, the Murath, amphibious, territorial, and deeply uninterested in diplomacy, had the oldest claim and approximately 40 warships to back it up. The Accord, which was built on the principle that paperwork moved faster than weapons, had been negotiating the expanse question for 80 years. Then the Murath stopped negotiating. They didn't announce it. They didn't send a declaration. 3 Velthari survey vessels disappeared in the outer expanse over a period of 6 weeks. Then a Dorhai transport. Then a research station on the edge of System 9 went dark. Not damaged, not destroyed, just silent. And when an Accord inspection vessel arrived, they found every console wiped, every log deleted, and a single Murath territorial marker planted in the station's central atrium like a flag in conquered ground. The Accord convened an emergency session. Seal Varath sat through 16 hours of formal recrimination, 3 procedural collapses, and 1 incident involving the Dorhai lead negotiator, and a translation error so catastrophic it required a 15-minute recess. He was exhausted in the specific way that only bureaucratic futility could produce, a tiredness that lived in the upper back and behind the eyes. It was during the 4th hour of the 2nd day that Commander Farron spoke. She had been sitting in the human delegation's observation tier. Humans were observers, not full members, as a distinction the Accord maintained with the same cheerful condescension it applied to most things, and she had been quiet for the entirety of the proceedings. When she stood, Seal Varath almost missed it. "I have a question," she said, through her translator. Her voice was flat, conversational. The floor recognized her technically, because declining to do so would have required a procedural vote that nobody wanted to initiate. "The Accord has been negotiating the expanse question for 80 years, she said. "The Murith have now forcibly occupied at minimum one Accord-adjacent installation and destroyed 3 survey vessels. My question is, what changed?" Silence. 80 years of stable stalemate, Farron continued. Then inside of 2 months, 4 incidents. I'm asking what changed on the Murath side, not diplomatically, tactically. The Accord's senior analyst, a Velthari named Orveth San, whose job was exactly this kind of question, cleared his throat. The Murath have historically avoided direct escalation due to their supply chain vulnerabilities in deep expanse territory. Their closest resupply hub was, Farron said. A pause. "I'm sorry?" Past tense. Their closest resupply hub was their primary concern. 6 months ago, they commissioned a new orbital depot in System 14. Deep expanse. It went online 9 weeks ago. She set a data chip on the table, a physical chip, which several Accord members found vaguely archaic. Supply chain problem solved. They've been planning this for 2 years at minimum. The negotiating table was a waiting room. Seal Varath looked at Orveth San. Orveth San looked at his own data lattice with the expression of a man who had just found a hole in a garment he'd been wearing in public. "The Murath have 40 warships in the expanse," Farron said. "They'll have full territorial control inside of 4 months if nothing changes. I'd like to formally request that the human delegation be permitted to contribute to the response effort." "The Human Accord delegation," Seal Varath said, careful and precise, "is an observer status delegation. The security response is the purview of—" "I know what it's the purview of." Still flat. Still completely conversational. "I'm asking anyway." The vote to decline the request passed 14-3. Farron sat back down. Seal Varath watched her face. That expression again. Not anger. Noted. The Accord's security response to the Murath escalation was, by any military standard, coherent. 17 Velthari warships, 12 Dorhai heavy cruisers, a joint tactical command installed on a repurposed research station at the Expanse's entry corridor. Rules of engagement drafted over 3 weeks of interspecies committee work that produced a document so precise and so thoroughly qualified that it barely resembled an order to do anything at all. They called it Operation Threshold. It failed in 11 days. Not catastrophically, nothing exploded. No one died in numbers that would generate a memorial. It failed the way bureaucratic military operations fail. Incrementally, then comprehensively. The Murath, who had been fighting territorial wars for 4,000 years and had absolutely no equivalent of an interspecies committee, simply didn't engage on the terms the Accord expected. They didn't mass their warships for a confrontation. They dispersed. Hit a supply line here, a sensor relay there. Cut communication between 2 Accord vessels at a moment when Joint Command needed them coordinated. The Velthari and Dorhai tactical commanders kept filing reports to the Joint Command Station and waiting for unified orders that took hours to produce and arrived obsolete. By day 11, the Murath had taken System 12. By day 15, they had begun the soft occupation of System 10. Not warships, just settlement vessels, civilian-flagged, carrying Murath colonists who were technically not a military force and therefore couldn't be engaged under the Accord's rules of engagement without a new committee vote. It was elegant, Seal Varath thought. He hated how elegant it was. He was in the Joint Command Station's briefing room when the communication request came in. Flagged human delegation. He almost declined it on reflex. Human observers had no standing in the security command structure. But something stopped him. Maybe the way Farron had said noted 3 weeks ago and somehow made it sound like a beginning. He accepted. Her face on the screen was the same. Unremarkable uniform. That flat conversational energy. They're going to take System 8 in the next 8 days, she said, without preamble. Not with warships. Same method. Settlement vessels, civilian designation. Your rules of engagement don't cover it, and reconfiguring them will take longer than 8 days. You know this. I'm aware of the situation, Seal Varath said. I'd like to propose a different approach. Commander Farron. With respect, the human delegation is... I know what we are. A pause that felt, oddly, like a controlled thing. Like she was choosing the next words from a larger set of available words and being deliberate about it. I'm not asking for a committee vote. I'm not asking for a delegation status review. I'm asking you, personally, for permission to deploy a small team to System 8 ahead of the settlement vessels. Non-Accord personnel. Outside the rules of engagement entirely, because they'd be operating outside Accord authority entirely. Whatever happens, it doesn't touch the Joint Command record. Seal Varath's translation lattice flickered. You're asking me to authorize an unsanctioned human military operation in contested, Accord-adjacent space. I'm asking you to look the other way for 72 hours, she said, and then ask the Murath settlement fleet why they've changed their heading. He stared at her for a long moment. What exactly would this team do? Farron's expression did something then. Small. Almost nothing. The corners of her mouth moved in a way that his translation lattice flagged as humor register, subtype, private. Convince them, she said, that System 8 isn't worth it. He said yes. He told himself it was strategic pragmatism. He told himself the Accord's response had failed and something had to fill the gap. He told himself a lot of things, in the specific way that people who are about to do something they can't officially acknowledge convince themselves it's reasonable. He gave her 72 hours and looked the other way. What happened in System 8 during those 72 hours was, officially, nothing. The sensor relays in that system experienced an anomalous data blackout. The Joint Command record showed no Accord activity, no vessels, no engagement. A technical fault, poorly timed. On Hour 73, the Murath settlement fleet, 11 vessels, carrying roughly 4,000 colonists and enough infrastructure material to establish a permanent presence, altered course. Not slightly, completely. They turned around and headed back towards System 14 at a speed that, in a human vessel, would have indicated urgency. Seal Varath requested a Murath communication intercept through back channels that he also didn't officially have. What came back was incomplete. The Murath used a cipher rotation that the Accord's analysts hadn't fully cracked, but fragments of it came through. The fragments described something in System 8. Not a fleet, not warships, something smaller. 11 contacts, the intercept said. 11 matching the settlement fleet's own number, moving without any detectable drive signature, appearing on the Murath sensors from 4 different vectors simultaneously, disappearing before targeting solutions could be established, and then reappearing somewhere else. The settlement fleet's commander had attempted to hail them. No response. Had attempted to run. The 11 contacts had matched speed and held position at exactly the edge of weapons range. Exactly. For 9 hours. 9 hours. No shot fired, no threat transmitted, no communication of any kind. Just presence. Calculated. Patient. 11 human shadows holding position at the edge of someone else's weapons range for 9 hours until the someone else decided, apparently, that whatever System 8 contained was not worth finding out the hard way. Seal Varath read the intercept 3 times. Then he called up the human delegation's official observer file and looked at it for a long time. Pending review, it said. He changed it to active. The Accord had a word for what Seal Varath had done. It also translated roughly as pending review, which was, he was beginning to understand, the Accord's answer to everything it didn't know how to categorize. He had not reported the System 8 operation. He had not reported the communication intercept. He had not reported his conversation with Farron, or the 72 hours of deliberate sensor blindness, or the fact that he had, in a technical and completely deniable sense, authorized a human covert military action in contested space. He had, instead, filed a report attributing the Murath settlement fleet's withdrawal to an unresolved internal logistical dispute, and moved on. Orveth San, his analyst, had looked at that report with the expression of a man who suspected the garment had more holes than initially counted. He had not said anything. That was, Seal Varath reflected, the most useful thing about Orveth San. The Accord convened again 2 weeks after System 8. The Murath, whose settlement strategy had apparently encountered something they found motivating enough to reconsider, had not advanced further into the expanse. System 12 remained occupied. The Accord wasn't going to get that back without either a negotiation breakthrough or a military engagement. They didn't have the committee votes for. But Systems 10, 8, and the rest of the inner expanse had remained untouched. A stalemate. An unsatisfying, incomplete stalemate. The Accord called it a partial success and began drafting new negotiating terms with the energy of an institution that was deeply relieved to be back on familiar ground. Commander Farron attended the session. She sat in the observer tier. She said nothing. After the session, Seal Varath found her in the corridor outside. He'd looked for her, which he acknowledged to himself was a thing he was doing. "The settlement fleet," he said. "What did your team do?" She looked at him for a moment. "I told you. We convinced them System 8 wasn't worth it." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer that doesn't create a record." A pause. "You have my gratitude for the 72 hours. He studied her face. The translation lattice was running, but flagging a consistent insufficient data on her expression. Not because she was emoting incorrectly, but because whatever was running underneath the surface of her face was something the lattice had apparently never been trained on. "I've been in diplomatic service for 40 years, he said. "I've dealt with 63 species. I have never encountered a military force that holds position at weapons range for 9 hours and fires nothing." Farron was quiet for a moment. "The Murath Respect Force," she said. "They understand warships and weapons and engagement ranges. They understand what weapons range means. They've been fighting territorial wars for 4,000 years. If we'd fired on them, they would have known exactly what we were and exactly how to respond to us." She paused again. "We didn't fire. We didn't transmit. We just stayed. And they didn't know what to do with something that could have killed them but didn't. Something that was choosing not to. That's a different kind of threat than anything they have a doctrine for." Seal Varath thought about that for a long time. "How many people were in your team?" She smiled. Actually smiled, which his translation lattice flagged as genuine subtype. Rare. "Not 11, she said. She walked away before he could ask the next question. The Accord elevated human observer status to associate delegation 3 months later. It was framed as a routine administrative update. It passed without significant debate, which Seal Varath suspected was less about human diplomatic pressure and more about the fact that several Accord members had by then. They heard rumors about System 8 that they couldn't verify and therefore couldn't officially discuss and therefore couldn't officially discount. Rumors traveled differently in space than on planets. They moved slower in some ways. You had to physically carry them between systems, but they accumulated weight differently. A rumor that arrived via a Murath cargo vessel, told by a crew member to a dockmaster at a neutral station, translated twice through imperfect language filters and arriving garbled and strange at an Accord listening post, had a different texture than a diplomatic communique. It felt older somehow, heavier, like something that had been handled. The rumor that reached Seal Varath's desk said, "The humans sent ghosts." He filed it under pending review and tried to concentrate on the expanse negotiations, which were proceeding with the usual pace of a geological process. The crisis that changed everything began, as most defining moments do, with something that looked administrative. A Dorhai mining consortium, private, not government-affiliated, operating under an Accord commercial license, had been extracting rare earth composites from an asteroid belt in a system designated EN7. which sat technically outside the expanse but practically adjacent to it, in the gap between contested and claimed space that everyone used as a buffer and nobody officially governed. They had been operating there for 11 years. They employed approximately 800 door-high workers, plus assorted support staff from 4 other species. The Murath didn't have a claim on EN7. They had, however, apparently decided to acquire one. The attack on the EN7 mining consortium wasn't a military operation in any formal sense. The Accord would later determine that the vessels involved were crewed by Murath private contractors, a designation that was, like most things in the Expanse situation, technically true and practically meaningless. 800 workers, 4 Accord-registered installations, 200 hours of brutal systematic demolition that began with the communications array and ended with the evacuation ships. The evacuation ships were disabled, not destroyed. Seal Varath would think about that for years. Disabled, not destroyed. The people were alive. The Murath wanted the territory, not the bodies. The workers were alive on non-functional ships, drifting in a system with no Accord presence and no rescue assets within range. But the Murath private contractors had departed. The Accord received the distress signals and convened an emergency session. The emergency session took 9 hours. In the 9 hours of the session, 3 of the disabled evacuation vessels experienced cascading life support failures from the same battle damage that had disabled their drives. The session was informed of this in real time. It continued. There were procedures. There were standing protocols. The nearest Accord military assets were 4 days out. A response force could be assembled in, the estimates varied, 6 to 10 days. The survivors could be expected to hold on their backup life support for, the medical analysis was inconclusive, but the most cited figure was 5 to 7 days for most of the vessels, 3 for the 3 with active damage. The math was not favorable. The math was being discussed when Farron walked onto the session floor. Not the observer tier, the floor. She didn't ask for recognition. She just walked to the center, stood, and said, clearly and without any particular urgency, "We need to end this session." Seal Varath, presiding, said, "Commander Farran, you do not have floor authority." 800 people are dying, she said. "You've been in session for 9 hours. I need the session to end so I can leave this station and go get them. The response protocol requires assets we don't have in position. I have assets in position." She looked at him directly. "I need the session to end. I need you to stand up from that chair, Ambassador, and tell me I'm authorized to move." The chamber was silent in the specific way that large rooms go silent when something that was going to happen becomes visible. Seal Varath stood up. He was aware, dimly, that he was burning through his diplomatic career. He was aware that an informal authorization from a presiding ambassador during an emergency session was not, strictly speaking, legal authorization for anything. He was aware that what he was about to say would require a significant amount of retroactive paperwork and possibly an inquiry. "You're authorized to move," he said. What happened between that moment and the rescue of 743 survivors in the EN7 system was, in its official form, a human commercial salvage operation that happened to arrive in the area while conducting survey work and rendered aid under standard interstellar humanitarian protocol. The informal record was different. Seal Varath pieced it together over the following weeks from fragments, crew reports, Accord sensor readings from the nearest relay, 2 testimonies from Dorai survivors who described what they saw in terms that his translation lattice flagged as extreme distress register, possible exaggeration. He was not sure it was exaggeration. Farran's team had reached EN7 in 14 hours. The Accord's fastest military vessel under emergency protocols would have taken 4 days. He had verified this. He had verified it several times, because 14 hours required a speed that wasn't consistent with any registered human vessel's drive specifications, and Seal Varath was a man who trusted math. When he asked Farran about it, she said, "Modified drives." Modified to what specification? Ones that aren't on record. He stopped asking about the drives. What the Dori survivors described was a boarding operation conducted in total silence, in hard vacuum, between two disabled vessels whose airlocks had been damaged and sealed by the attack. The human team had entered through the hull. Not through a hole, through the hull, using equipment the survivors couldn't identify, and two of them described, uncertainly, as cutting that didn't cut, more like the metal moved aside. They had reached the life support sections in less than 20 minutes. It stabilized 3 critical failures by methods that the Dorhai engineers on board described as not standard procedure, but completely functional, and then transferred the survivors to a transport that should not have been able to carry that many people, but did. 743 people. The 3 vessels with active damage had lost 42 people before the team arrived. Farron had filed this in her report in a single line. Seal Varath had read it many times. The flatness of that sentence, 42, period, next item, told him something about what kind of thing that number was to her. Not data, the opposite of data. A weight she wasn't going to discuss. The Murath private contractors who had conducted the EN-7 operation were tracked by Accord intelligence to a staging depot in System 16, Deep Expanse. They were there for 11 days while the Accord considered its response options. On the 12th day, the depot went dark. Not attacked. Not destroyed. Dark. Systems offline. All 53 vessels that had been docked there had filed flight plans simultaneously. An anomaly the depot's automated systems had apparently not been designed to prevent, and departed in 53 different directions at roughly the same time, which was 4 hours before the depot went offline. When an Accord inspection vessel reached the depot 4 days later, they found it intact. They found 53 empty berths. They found every navigation record wiped. And they found, in the depot commander's personal quarters, a communication that had been printed on physical material, an archaism that Seal Varath now recognized, and left on the desk where someone would find it. He received the translation through his back channels, which were getting a great deal of use lately. The communication said, in Murath military cipher, "We know you're watching. We know you've been watching since System 8. The EN-7 operation was a contracted private action. The Murath Territorial Expansion Authority disclaims all involvement. We are prepared to discuss the return of System 12 under Accord mediation." Seal Varath read it 3 times. The humans had never approached the depot. There was no evidence they had been within sensor range. Whatever the Murath depot commander had felt watching those berths empty, whatever he had imagined was outside, was watching. I was waiting with the same patient terrible stillness that had held position at weapons range for 9 hours and fired nothing. Had been enough. The Murath wanted to talk. They had never wanted to talk in 80 years of Accord negotiation. The paperwork, the committees, the diplomatic patience. None of it had moved them. 11 humans in a system they couldn't fully scan, doing nothing, had moved them. Seal Varath called Farron. "The Murath want to negotiate," he said. "I know," she said. "How?" "We've been listening to their communications for 6 weeks." He stopped. "You have assets in Murath space." "Had," she said. "They're out now. We got what we needed." "Commander Farron." He stopped again, trying to organize the specific shape of what he wanted to say. "What exactly is it that you do? Your team? Oh, what are you?" The pause that followed was not long, but it was considered. He could feel it being considered. "The Accord sends diplomats when there's a table to sit at," she said. "It sends warships when there's a battle to fight. We're what gets sent when there's no table, and no battle is viable." A pause. "We're the option that exists between those 2 things. That's still not a name." "No," she said. "It's not." She ended the communication. Seal Varath sat for a long time in his office and looked at the wall and thought about something he'd read once in a xenoanthropology text. A paper about human military history, written by a Velthari scholar who had found the subject bizarre and somewhat alarming. The paper had noted, in its dry academic way, that humans had, for most of their planetary history, maintained a category of warrior distinct from their standing armies. A category that operated in the spaces the armies couldn't reach. That moved without supply lines. That held objectives for impossibly long periods with impossibly small numbers. That was trained not only to fight, but to disappear, to persist, to outlast, to be, in some fundamental way, more uncomfortable to your enemy than your enemy could be to you. The scholar had noted this as a curious evolutionary artifact of human tribal conflict, likely vestigial in the modern context. Sealvereth suspected the scholar had been wrong about the vestigial part. The Murath negotiations took 7 months. They were the most efficient negotiations the Accord had conducted in the Expanse question in 80 years, which Sealvereth found interesting only in relation to what had happened before them. The Murath negotiating team arrived with a fundamentally different quality of attention than they had brought to any previous session. They were not conciliatory. The Murath were constitutionally incapable of conciliatory, which Sealvereth had always found straightforwardly comprehensible, having met many species similarly constituted. They were not warm. They were not cooperative in any of the soft senses the Accord tended to value. They were, however, focused. They came to each session with their arguments prepared and their bottom lines defined in advance, and when the Accord pushed, they pushed back in kind, and when the Accord offered something real, they took it seriously. It was the behavior, Sealvereth thought, of a species that had made a calculation and was following through on it. Not peace-seeking, efficiency-seeking. Whatever the Murath had decided about the humans in the Expanse, whatever the depot commander had felt in that moment with 53 empty berths and the imagination of something outside, watching, had moved their math. 80 years of arguments about survey rights and resource access and territorial jurisdiction had not moved the Murath math. The humans had moved it in 14 hours, plus a few weeks of very quiet listening. He found himself thinking about that constantly. He found himself watching Commander Farron across the chamber floor during sessions. She was present for all of them now, her delegation status having been formally elevated twice in the past year, and trying to read her face for something that would explain it. The math. Whatever internal equation produced a military doctrine of hold, wait, watch, do not fire. Let the enemy's imagination do what weapons cannot. He couldn't read it. The translation lattice had essentially given up trying to tag her expressions as standard emotional states and now just returned insufficient reference category, which felt, in its way, like the most honest thing it had ever reported. The name arrived from an unexpected direction. There was a species called the Rain, long-lived, cautious, deeply interested in record-keeping, one of the Accord's oldest members. The Rain maintained a cultural archive that was, in the estimation of most xenohistorians, the most comprehensive in known space. 8,000 years of collected memory from 400 species, catalogued with the kind of taxonomic compulsion that only manifested in species who had watched enough civilizations rise and collapse to develop strong opinions about not forgetting things. A Rain archivist named Sorveth An, no relation to Sealvereth's analyst, despite the rhyme, though the translation coincidence was the kind of thing that made you briefly question the universe, had been, for the past several years, conducting what he described as a structural analysis of military historical emergence patterns. He was specifically interested in the moment when a previously underestimated force became a known quantity, when the galaxy's mental model of a species updated from pending review to something with weight and shape and specific content. He had been tracking the humans for 18 months. He presented his findings to the Accord Cultural Committee, a body that most of the Security Consortium viewed with the polite indifference you extend to something useful that you don't fully understand. In a session that was attended by approximately 40 people, which for a Cultural Committee session was an enormous turnout and suggested that the word had gotten out. Sealvereth attended. Farran attended in the observer tier, which she was still technically required to use, even though the distinction had begun to feel increasingly nominal. Sorveth Arn was old. His age showed in the specific way Rain age showed. Not deterioration, but accumulation. A quality of having been there for too much. A stillness that read as geological rather than biological. He spoke carefully and at length, because Rain always spoke carefully and at length. And what he said, compressed to its essential architecture, was this. The galaxy had seen many species move from unknown to known. The pattern was usually military. A species achieved some threshold of force projection, fought a war that demonstrated it, and was thereafter categorized accordingly. The mental model updated because a sufficiently large number of ships and weapons made the update unavoidable. But what was happening with the humans was structurally different. "There is no battle of record," Sorveth Arn said. "There is no fleet engagement, no decisive military confrontation, no quantifiable demonstration of force that I can point to as the origin of the shift in galactic perception. And yet the shift is occurring. I have documented 37 species whose strategic planning has been modified in the past 2 years to account for human capacity. Not based on observed force, but based on inference. Based on what has been implied. Based on the presence of actors whose actions are consistently characterized in the testimonies of those who have encountered them in one of 3 ways." He paused for effect, and Seal Vareth noted that 8,000 years of record-keeping had not eliminated the instinct for dramatic timing. 1. They were there, and then they were not, and the situation had changed. 2. We did not see them, but we knew they were watching, and this was sufficient to alter our behavior. 3. We engaged them on our terms, and they responded on terms we did not have a doctrine for. Silence. The galaxy is updating its model of humanity, Sorveth Arn continued, without evidence in the traditional sense. It is updating based on a quality that our archive has only one historical analogue for. A class of operator so specifically calibrated to the space between diplomacy and declared warfare that their primary weapon is not force but the imagination of force. The question their presence asks is not can they hurt us. The question is, what are they willing to do that we haven't thought of yet? He pulled up a holographic display. The Rain loved holographic displays in the same way they loved cataloguing, which was to say, completely, and showed a map of the Expanse situation, the EN7 rescue, the depot incident, System 8, the settlement fleet's reversal. Red lines connecting points. Our archive has a name for this class of military actor, he said. In 6 previous civilizations across recorded history, forces operating by this doctrine have emerged and been recognized. In every case, the recognition came not from the force itself announcing its nature, but from the accumulated testimony of those who encountered it and survived, and described what they had encountered. The name comes from the accumulated testimony. He paused again. So, in each previous civilization, the name was different. In each case, the name was feared. He looked at the chamber. He looked, specifically, at the human delegation's tier. "We believe we have a name for the human variant," he said. "It comes from the Murath. It was captured in a communication intercept between 2 Murath military commanders approximately 3 weeks after the EN7 incident. We believe it was coined by the depot commander who ordered the 53 departures." A pause. The Murath word translates most precisely as "the ones the dark sends." The chamber went very quiet. Seal Vareth looked at Farron. She was sitting perfectly still in the observer tier, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her face doing the thing his translation lattice could never name. He watched her take in the phrase, "the ones the dark sends," and hold it in the way you hold something you've been given that you didn't expect and aren't entirely sure what to do with. Not pride, he was sure of that. It wasn't the face of someone receiving a compliment. It was the face of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had just had the weight acknowledged by someone who hadn't previously known it existed. Something in between recognition and grief. She looked at him. Across the chamber, across all the accumulated diplomatic distance and species designation and pending reviews, she looked at him. And for the first time in 2 years of working in the same building, trying to read her face and getting insufficient reference category back, he understood what the expression was. It was what you looked like when you were the thing that got sent when everything else had failed. When you operated in the space between options, in the dark that existed between diplomacy and war. When you held position at weapons range and fired nothing for 9 hours, not because you couldn't fire, but because the weapon you were choosing to use was the enemy's own imagination, and the only way it worked was if you never resolved the question of what you might do. When you reached into a dying station through a hull that moved aside and carried out 743 people and filed 42 casualties in a single flat line, because the weight of it wasn't something you put in a report. It was what you looked like when you were necessary. Not celebrated, not honored, necessary. The Accord voted on human full membership status 6 weeks after Sorveth Ann's presentation. It passed. Not unanimously. Nothing in the Accord ever passed unanimously because unanimity required everyone to agree. And the Accord contained species for whom agreeing was essentially a biological violation. But it passed by a margin that Seal Varath had not expected, and that the Accord's own procedural analysts described, in their dry bureaucratic way, as decisive. He found Farron afterward, in the same corridor where she had walked away from him 2 years ago without answering his last question. "Full membership," he said. "I saw. The vote was faster than I anticipated." "You anticipated it would be slower?" "I anticipated several months of procedural delay." He paused. Several Accord members apparently became motivated when the Dorai Mining Consortium began lobbying loudly. 743 people make a strong argument. Farron was quiet for a moment. The 42 make a stronger one. He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure what answer it required. "Sorveth Ann's presentation," he said. "The name, the ones the dark sends. Does your government know he was going to say that?" "No." "Does your team?" She looked at him with something small in her face. "They'd hate it," she said. "They don't think of themselves that way. Most of them would say they're just very thorough about preparation and very committed to the objective." A pause. "They're not wrong. That's most of what it is. And the rest?" A longer pause. Something in her face that he thought might be the closest thing she had to openness. "The rest is that they've been doing this for years, in systems that don't officially exist, for outcomes that don't get official records, and none of them have ever asked for a name. They don't do it to be known." She looked at the corridor. "The galaxy naming them is—" She trailed off. "They're going to hate it," she said again, but softer. Seal Varath thought about 11 invisible contacts holding position for 9 hours. About a hull that moved aside. About a depot commander watching 53 berths empty because of something he couldn't see but knew was there. About an old Rain archivist looking at a map of red connecting lines and finding a pattern that 6 previous civilizations had each generated in their own way and named in their own language and feared. "They've earned it," he said. Farron looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," she said. "That's the problem." She walked away down the corridor. He watched her go. She walked the way she always walked. That same unremarkable, efficient movement that carried no announcement of itself, that could pass through a room and not quite register. That was somehow the most dangerous feeling thing in any space it occupied once you knew what it was. The ones the dark sends. He stood in the corridor for a while after she was gone. The galaxy had a word for them now. And they hadn't given it to themselves. It had been dragged out of the mouths of the enemies they had stood in the dark beside and never fired on. Earned from the testimony of people who had survived the encounter and struggled to describe what they'd encountered. Named, ultimately, by the oldest fear any species had. Not the fear of a weapon aimed at you, but the fear of a thing you can't fully see, that seems to understand something you don't, that holds the question of its own capability open like a door you can't close. The Accord had voted humanity full membership in a chamber full of species who had, for 2 centuries, filed the human delegation under pending review. It had taken one woman, 2 wars, and a handful of people who understood that the most devastating thing you could do to an enemy wasn't destroy them. It was make them wonder, every day after, whether you were still out there, whether you were watching, whether the dark was occupied. It always was.